That right there is the first vehicle to have ever made it to the South Pole.
I've driven all the way from my home in Scotland to Beauvais, a beautiful town in northern France and home to the gigantic headquarters of Massey Ferguson, one of the world's largest tractor and machinery manufacturers. And after asking them very nicely, they let me into a quiet corner of their huge design office to see one of the most important vehicles in Antarctic history.
So here we are with, well, as you can see, Sue. Here's the cab. It's quite amazing, isn't it? Very Spartan, if you consider driving thousands of miles through Antarctica, minus 40 degrees Celsius, and this is all the protection that you had. I never thought in my life I'd be able to see a real one up close. May not look like it, but this simple, red little 28 horsepower tractor was the first to ever traverse from the coastline of Antarctica all the way into its frozen centre. On the 4th of January 1958, Edmund Hillary, who had only a few years previously become the first man to summit Mount Everest, was the first man to traverse from the coastline of Antarctica all the way into its frozen centre using overland motorised transport. And the first man since Robert Falcon Scott, who had tragically died on his return from the South Pole almost 40 years earlier.
This is it. The Americans at the pole station have come out to meet us. They seem as pleased to see us as we them. It's January the 4th, 1958, 82 days after the tractor train left Scott Base, the faithful tractors we leave behind. Hard to believe that web tracks fitted over wheels brought us 1,200 rough miles.
The choice of these tractors was no fluke. Hillary had chosen his mode of transport carefully, settling on what was and remains one of the greatest pieces of mass-produced mechanical engineering ever invented.
Now, I'm willing to put my money where my mouth is with that claim because I own one. This is my diesel-engined 1955 Ferguson TEF20, and it is probably the most reliable piece of equipment that I have ever owned. I still use it all the time. I'm currently using it to help assist the building of my house, which is what most of the videos on my second channel are dedicated to, and it's popped up there a few times. Now, look, I'm a little bit of a Ferguson obsessive. I love these machines. I think they are one of the greatest inventions of the 20th century. I'm even a card-carrying member of the official Ferguson Owners Club. But even I have to admit that a simple piece of farm machinery is an interesting choice as a vehicle to take you across the frozen wastes of Antarctica. But I suppose, thinking about it, it actually shows the true genius in the design and engineering of the Ferguson, the success of the platform, a machine of such unbelievable simplicity, reliability and adaptability that it was as at home up here in the north of Scotland ploughing a field as it was in the frozen wastes of Antarctica ploughing across to the South Pole. See, the Ferguson tractor was the brainchild of Harry Ferguson, a Northern Irish inventor and engineer who had dedicated decades of his life to trying to solve the inefficiencies of farming, an era still dominated by the use of manpower, horsepower and early, crude and inefficient tractors. The solution, debuting in 1946, was the TE20 and the Ferguson system, and it was a near instantaneous success. See, not only were Fergusons incredibly robust and reliable in their engine and drivetrain, they were also incredibly simple and easy to service and maintain. The genius of Ferguson was understanding that the people using these vehicles might be encountering a machine like this for the first time. Ferguson salesmen travelling up and down the country selling these things could train up a farmer who had never seen a tractor in their lives to operating one of these things in just a matter of hours. And when you sit here at the controls, you can really see how everything has been meticulously thought out. You've got your steering wheel in front of you and throttle, you've got simple access here to your clutch, gear stick and brake, and then you have first gear, second gear, third, fourth and reverse. And so long as you had petrol in the engine, you were off to the races. You know, it really is incredible just how easy these things are to drive. The steering feels light despite the fact there's no power steering at all. And you've got an incredible turning circle. I mean, look at this. I suppose the only downside is, if you were driving this too much, your ears would probably give up before the engine did. The last piece of genius though, and Harry Ferguson's greatest invention, has to be this, the 3-point linkage system that came with the Ferguson tractor. See, traditionally tractors could mainly tow. They could pull behind them ploughs or trailers or other implements, but there was no direct control on the part of the driver. The 3-point linkage system changed all that. It meant that any implement, for example a plough, could be fitted directly to the tractor, and it meant that rather than towing a plough, the tractor itself became the plough, with all the fine control and manoeuvrability that came with it. Ferguson hadn't just created a tractor, he'd created the Ferguson system, and with it the ability to turn this tractor into any implement you wanted. You could use it for farming, you could use it to help build a road, you could use it for sawing logs or drilling holes, you could turn this thing into a digger, or you could put it into a giant mechanical mech suit and make it roll a road for you. It was this combination of the expert design and robustness of the Ferguson tractor and platform, combined with the adaptability and seamlessness of the Ferguson system, the 3-point linkage, that had quite quickly made the Ferguson tractor the first choice for anyone, from a farmer wanting to plough a field to somebody planning an Antarctic expedition. And on the topic of seamlessness, if you want your business to act as one without getting bogged down in complexities like some old-fashioned tractor, maybe what you need is today's sponsor, Odoo. Odoo is the most powerful, intuitive and customizable business management platform ever made, and it has the ability to completely change the way you run your business and organize your life. In many ways, it's a little bit like the Ferguson system of management tools. See, Odoo presents you a library of apps tailored to each of your business needs, from invoicing, website creation, project management, and much, much more. I really like Odoo's detailed accounting application though, where you can generate invoices in just a few clicks, track expenses and transactions, and create financial reports to give you an overview of your finances all in one place. You can also sync your bank accounts for real-time tracking with over 28,000 different banks around the world. And best yet, Odoo will even apply local tax regulations automatically based on your location. Odoo has been invaluable for managing our business. It lets us easily see our finances at a glance, manage our accounting and generate any report we need. And I've used Odoo for years, whether it be finances or just for planning complex videos and researching projects just like this. But to add to the fact, I'm also building a house right now, which is probably the most stressful thing I'm ever going to do in my life. And having something like Odoo that takes the stress out of that element of work, to know that business needs are taken care of, well, it lets me focus on the other laundry list of invoices, bills and paperwork that are building up in my personal life. So try Odoo for yourself today. You can get access to all the apps for a very affordable plan, but remember, the first app is free for life with unlimited hosting and support. Check the link in the description below. Thanks again for the support, Odoo. And now let's get back to the Antarctic tractors.
By the 1950s, an international scramble for Antarctica was gaining momentum. Countries like Chile and Argentina were making increasingly assertive territorial claims, while the United States and Soviet Union were pushing ever deeper into the continent. Britain, which claimed sweeping territories across a large portion of Antarctica, had been fighting a losing battle to secure international recognition of these holdings. Successive British governments had struggled with post-war debts and the escalation of the Cold War, and had shown little interest in Antarctica, but the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953 and the successful British Mount Everest expedition that same year had captured global attention and sparked a renewed sense of national pride in Britain. Officials in charge of the country's polar interests were eager to ride the wave of momentum and were soon looking back to Britain's expeditionary past on the frozen continent. What better way to remind the world of Britain's place in Antarctica than to finally complete the first full crossing of it? Proposals for a full overland crossing of the Antarctic continent had existed for decades, with the last major attempt being Ernest Shackleton's ill-fated Endurance expedition in 1914. Now it would be Dr. Vivian Fuchs, an English geologist and scientist, who would take up the mantle. Fuchs proposed an ambitious expedition to traverse the continent from the Weddell to Ross Sea via the South Pole, envisioning the undertaking as a form of combined Commonwealth operation, drawing on Britain, Australia, New Zealand and Canada for finance, personnel and equipment. The plan, ironically, followed a similar idea to that of Shackleton's from decades earlier. Two parties would start on opposite coasts. One party, led by New Zealand, would establish a base in the Ross Sea and work inland, establishing supply depots for food and fuel at regular intervals. The main British party, meanwhile, having established a base on the Weddell Sea, would then make the full crossing, meeting with the Ross Sea party after crossing the pole and heading back together. It would be a grand statement to the world of Britain's Antarctic claims and heritage, and for New Zealand, a chance to also establish a presence in Antarctica in areas that they claimed as their own. Furthermore, leading the Kiwis would be Edmund Hillary, now an international star after his successful summit of Everest, and who would, it was hoped, bring even more attention and funding to the Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic Expedition.
Snowcats, tractors specially designed for snow travel, together with fuel and stores, are unloaded for the base, named after Shackleton. Everything needed to keep men alive in a hostile continent for another 2 years.
Fuch's team on the Weddell Sea would be the main crossing party, and as such outfitted with a larger set of vehicles that had been cobbled together for the expedition. Most impressively would undoubtedly be the 200 horsepower Chrysler V8 Tucker Snowcats, cutting-edge American-designed overland vehicles boasting 4 independent tracks. These were complemented by World War II-era M29 Weasels, a specially adapted Canadian muskeg tractor, and a complement of reliable Ferguson tractors. These were not Antarctica's first Ferguson tractors, however. In 1954, a single Ferguson TEA tractor had been shipped out to Antarctica by the Australian National Antarctic Research Expedition, or ANARE, to help establish Australia's first permanent base in Antarctica. With little alterations, it had very quickly proved to be an incredible workhorse, hauling countless supplies, grading and bulldozing tracks and foundations, and helping erect the base's first buildings and infrastructure. In December 1956, the advance party of the Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic Expedition headed for the Weddell Sea to establish Shackleton Base in preparation for crossing the following year, and first impressions of the vehicles when unloaded were mixed. The Tucker Snowcats were undoubtedly impressive, but the Weasels were old Canadian-supplied hand-me-downs in poor mechanical condition, and while the Fergusons were reliable as ever, their performance, especially in soft snow, even with newly supplied tracks to make them more akin to a half-track, was not ideal. Meanwhile, however, on the other end of Antarctica, landing a year after the advance party in December 1957, was the New Zealand contingent led by Edmund Hillary. Lacking the large and powerful Snowcats, they were equipped with similarly worn-out M29 Weasels and 5 brand new Ferguson tractors, supplied by Ferguson's New Zealand office and painted in a bright Arctic red. Unlike Fuchs, Hillary had been impressed by the performance of the British Fergusons on the Weddell Sea the previous year, as well as their well-known reliability with the Australians, and before returning to Antarctica to establish Scott Base, him and his team had been exploring ways of improving the performance of these adaptable tractors.
Now, these tracks here are not actually bespoke for Antarctica. They were altered by the team down there to make them more effective and stop them slipping off the wheels. But this was actually a factory edition that you could order. There were makers of tracks for Ferguson tractors, and the most famous one were the Bombardier tracks, made by the Bombardier company that made various overland snow buggies and the like. They're a Canadian company. Now, as part of the kit, you would get these tracks. You would also get this center wheel, but it was more of a half-track setup. They would go over the drive wheel at the back, this additional center wheel, but the front wheels would be left open so that you could steer it. Now, when Edmund Hillary was researching how to utilize these tractors for Antarctica, he actually traveled to Norway. And the Norwegian Ferguson agents had been working on different techniques to make these more effective in the snow. And during their testing with Edmund Hillary, they discovered that it worked best having this full track setup, with the track going over all 3 wheels on each side. Now, this obviously meant that you couldn't steer it very well. In fact, it did away with the need for a steering wheel entirely. And if you notice, the inside of these tractors don't have steering wheels. They actually have these 2 levers on either side. And that's because the Fergusons have quite a neat trick. They have independent brakes on either side. So you can stamp on the brake and brake just one wheel at the back. And this was good for getting out of mud or if you were stuck in the ground. But it also meant that you could basically alter these so that you could steer it like a tank, braking one side of the tracks and letting the other rather turn it. Now, this produced a little bit more strain on the engine, but it was found to be a much better system for getting over the snow, and especially the soft snow. That's where these things really struggled, the powdered snow in Antarctica. Now, you can actually see on the interior here, they have basically taken those brake pedals on either side and they've turned them into levers. They've welded on these black levers. And what you do is you would press forward or pull backwards, and that would brake one side, leave the other unbraked, and allow you to turn. You can see some of the most important upgrades here. They're painted in black. These are the welded sections, the non-standard sections that were added on. Now, these were strengthening bars because, remember, the brunt of the impacts against the super solid ice or even big, huge snowdrifts were happening to these front wheels here. And there had been a lot of issues with these smaller parts, already pretty robust, braking and bending under strain. If you guys have ever seen my video about the Volkswagen buggies that were taken to Antarctica by the Australian Antarctic Service, they had similar issues with their buggy. The front axle and the front floor pan was essentially braking constantly under the extreme pressure of hitting these really solid floes and blocks of ice.
With these alterations, some done before arrival and some implemented over the course of their use, establishing Scott Base, Hillary's Fergusons were proving far more capable in Antarctica than anyone had expected. Rather than purely relying on dog teams to move supplies to the depots, instead the dog teams were used to scout the route ahead. The teams de Havilland Canada Beaver would then fly in supplies, followed by the party of tractors towing the main depot of food and fuel. To offer some basic protection from the environment, Hillary's team also outfitted them with a basic canvas cabin, constructed mainly from Dexian shelving, but providing little cover other than from the worst of the freezing winds.
Now, looking at the inside of these, it's quite a Spartan setup, as you can imagine. It's quite remarkable to consider using these to drive the thousands of miles through complete and utter wilderness to get to the South Pole, and basically only having a little bit of canvas and this very bare metal screen to protect you from the outside elements. Now, it's interesting when you look at the cab here, the exhaust is actually routed down underneath and basically travels under the cab and comes out the back. These things were designed for pulling the caboose, as it was known, which was like a little mess room, bunk room that they could tow behind the tractors. It was Edmund Hillary's idea that they needed somewhere basically to shelter as they were camping down for the night or being towed along behind these tractors. But sometimes what happened is the exhaust went all the way through into the caboose at the back to basically provide heat. Now, there was a lot of close calls in these. Sometimes these things would break and fall through the ice. Sometimes, really, the only thing that stopped it was some of the machinery at the back or this little roll cage trapping it and stucking it in the ice. Now, imagine you're driving along here, no visibility at all. All of a sudden, you hear this kind of boom and thud. The ground opens up underneath you. And really, the only chance you've got is either climbing out through the top or jumping out through the back.
October the 14th, 1957. Hillary's support party sets out.
On the 14th of October 1957, Murray Ellis, Peter Mulgrew, Ron Ballum and Edmund Hillary departed on their longest trip south. 3 of the party's most reliable tractors and an M29 Weasel, all laden with sledges of fuel and supplies for the final depot closest to the South Pole. With their hodgepodge of makeshift equipment and run-down battered vehicles, the ragtag Kiwi party looked a far cry from a team that was bound for the interior of Antarctica. Their American neighbours at McMurdo Station, just a few miles from Scott Base, doubted they'd even make it 50 miles.
Now, these engines were relatively standard. There wasn't much done to them. Some of them had the fan reversed, so rather than sucking in cold air, they were actually going to be blowing warmer air back over the engine. They had a slight alteration to the starter motor to make it slightly more heavy duty. They had larger batteries installed. They often had to use blow torches on the fuel lines themselves in the mornings or when they were starting up again to try and get these things running because they had basically frozen solid. And these engines were pretty small. They were powerful and they were torquey, and they are still to this day incredibly capable engines for the machine. But they produce about 28 horsepower. Now, you will lose power every time you gain altitude and the atmosphere gets thinner. These things would be operating sometimes as high as 10,000 feet for stretches of the journey. Now, you'd be getting about 16 horsepower as a result from these 16, 14 horsepower from these machines. That's an incredibly low number when you consider the amount that they were hauling behind them. And also, it greatly increases fuel consumption because you then have to rev the engines even higher. At certain sections of the journey, they were achieving about 1 mile per gallon. And there was real concerns that these things would run out of fuel before they actually managed to make it to the South Pole.
From almost the moment they set off, conditions were relentless and severe. Whiteouts and hidden crevices threatened to stall the party or swallow a tractor whole at any moment. Temperatures plunged below minus 40 degrees centigrade. The tractors, despite their hardiness, required near daily maintenance. Stub axles were a recurring weak point, and fuel lines had to constantly be cleared to prevent freezing. The troublesome and increasingly unreliable Weasel had to be coaxed the entire way, and eventually later abandoned after it finally gave out. The Fergusons, which had had few real alterations from their factory configuration, were being pushed to their absolute limits.
700 miles inland, the limit of the aircraft's range, last and most southerly depot. Hillary's fifth and final fuel and food dump, in readiness for the crossing party.
Despite these immense challenges, by the 15th of December, Hillary's party had reached the area where Depot 700 was to be established, with the expedition's Beaver aircraft flying in the last of the supplies 5 days later. Hillary's team had fulfilled their official task, reaching the final depot and preparing to receive Fuch's party and guide them home. But, compared to Fuch's party, Hillary's traversal was starting to look like a walk in the park. Plagued with mechanical issues, extreme weather and dangerous, unpredictable terrain, the convoy of vehicles were still 1,200 miles away and weren't going to arrive anytime soon. Hillary, unable to wait at Depot 700 any longer, and sensing an opportunity to both plot out the route ahead of them for their approaching party and get his Kiwi contingent to the pole first, made a decision. They would push for the South Pole. On the 20th of December, Hillary and his team, along with their 3 tractors and a minimal load of fuel and rations, set off. It quickly became a desperate race. Snow conditions worsened, mechanical faults increased, and fuel consumption soared. To stay moving, the team began shedding weight, abandoning spare parts, sledges, and even food stores. By the 2nd of January, they were just 70 miles from the pole, but with only 180 gallons of fuel remaining, barely enough for the increasingly greedy, oxygen-starved standard engines of the Fergusons.
For Hillary, with tractors never designed for work at high altitudes, fuel consumption was now running alarmingly high. Everything superfluous jettisoned, he was pushing on the last 100 miles to the pole with 3 tractors and only 1 loaded sledge.
In what had already been a brutal journey, the final push had become a grueling crawl. For 24 straight hours, the team and tractors crawled across the plateau without stopping. But by midday on the 4th of January 1958, exhausted and near breaking point, they arrived at the South Pole. Against all odds, Hillary and his undersupplied team, equipped with simple tractors and outdated makeshift equipment, had completed the first overland journey to the South Pole since Amundsen and Scott decades before, and the first ever using motorised vehicles. They had just enough fuel to go another 15 miles. Hillary later remarked that the fact that in a trek of over 1,300 miles and taking 3 months had been made by ordinary farm tractors that anyone could buy in the worst weather in the world, and the tractors had never given any serious trouble, was impressive.
You know, the thing is, the New Zealand contribution to the Trans-Antarctic Commonwealth Expedition is really interesting and a little bit controversial sometimes, because some people look at Edmund Hillary having kind of usurped the actual expedition and having just, done it himself, gone there first with 3 old tractors. But I think it really speaks to that idea of New Zealand ingenuity, that idea of not having all the funds, having all of the materials, having all the fanciest or newest equipment, but it doesn't really matter. It's about skills and ingenuity and just grit, and that's really what got them to the South Pole in these 3 farm tractors. And the craziest thing is, you could have shipped these farm tractors home, you could have just probably put some petrol in this today, fire it up, take it outside, and you could just put this thing straight back to work. Like, it's truly remarkable. And this thing will be approaching 100 years old in not that long a time. Yeah, quite amazing. And how amazing to have actually been able to get here and see one of these. I never thought in my life I'd be able to see a real one up close. The rest are down in New Zealand. So to be able to see one up close, not too far from home, only a 24-hour drive away, is, truly something special.
On the other side of the continent, despite the delays and worsening weather, Fuchs and his party were still committed to reaching the pole and completing what Fuchs envisioned as their real purpose there, a complete continental crossing of Antarctica. Delayed by brutal weather, shifting ice and mechanical challenges, the British crossing party nonetheless reached the pole on the 19th of January 1958 and warmly received by their Kiwi counterparts and members of the newly established United States Research Station. After this brief reunion at the pole, the combined expedition turned north, beginning the final leg across the polar plateau and down the Shackleton Glacier. On the 2nd of March 1958, 99 days and over 2,100 miles after departing Shackleton Base, Fuchs and his team arrived at Scott Base, completing the first overland crossing of Antarctica via the South Pole. Like Scott before him, Fuchs had been pipped to the pole, but they had accomplished a first, an overland crossing of the harshest continent on Earth, and finally completing what Ernest Shackleton had set out to do some 44 years earlier, and an achievement that wouldn't be replicated until Ranulph Fiennes' Trans-Globe expedition some 23 years later.
Now, you might expect that after such a long and incredible record-setting journey, the three South Pole Fergusons would be ushered off into a nice retirement somewhere in a museum. But no, they were actually left out at the South Pole Station, the Scott Amundsen Station, and they were used by the Americans as work vehicles, basically moving around supplies and the like for years. It wouldn't be, I believe, until the early 1960s that they were repatriated back first to the McMurdo Sound and then handed back and sent out to museums. Two of them are now in two different museums down in New Zealand, and one of them, Sue, which I went to go and visit, was first moved to England to the Massey Ferguson headquarters, and then eventually moved to Beauvais, which is where today the main kind of industrial plant and headquarters of Massey Ferguson is. And, well, like I say, quite an incredible moment walking in there and seeing Sue, that small, tiny tractor. I mean, when you see one of these tractors in real life, you realise just how small they are. But after filming Sue, the folks at Massey Ferguson, I must say a big thanks, were very accommodating. They were happy when this strange Scottish man turned up and said, would I be able to film your tractor tucked away in one of their back offices in a corridor. But after I filmed it and I did all my filming, they took me on this amazing tour through this massive site. I mean, the Beauvais site is like a town in and of itself, all dedicated towards the construction of these, huge tractors. And they took me to the technology centre. And in there was a number of historical, unique Ferguson products, old Fergusons and the like, including a Model A, the very first Ferguson ever made using the three-point linkage system. But then outside the technology centre is Antarctica 2, or the tractor that Massey Ferguson in 2014 used on their Antarctica 2 expedition to replicate the journey made by the TE-20s. And it's a big modern, I think it's an MF 5610, it's got all the bells and whistles. They made this incredible journey in 2014. It's now there on display as well. And contrasting and comparing the old original Sue that I had seen, a few moments earlier, and then seeing this brand new, all bells and whistles, probably with air conditioning and heating and nice, beautiful, comfy seats. It really makes you realise, one, the advance of technology, but also just what these guys were dealing with back in 1958. But I think that concludes the story of the Antarctic Fergusons. An amazing story I wanted to tell for a very, very long time. And this story actually reminded me quite a lot of that apocryphal myth about NASA and the Soviets during the space race when they were developing writing implements. And the story goes that NASA spent millions of dollars developing this space pen it could write upside down and the like. And the Soviets, in their pragmatic way, just used a pencil. And of course, it's not true, but it kind of represents the different approaches and thought processes behind engineering solutions between the two superpowers. And it's interesting because the kind of reverse happened. In 1959, the Soviets would turn up to the South Pole, surprising the Americans at the Amundsen Scott Station in their Khakovchankas. They had driven them across, I believe, from the Vostok station, these huge, all singing, all dancing, self-contained mobile bases where you had bedrooms and bunks and a living room and a galley and a little laboratory and all this kind of stuff. And they turned up in these huge vehicles, some of the biggest vehicles ever made. And the Americans probably went, wow, these things are incredible. Funnily enough, last year, the Kiwis were here from Scott Base, and they drove over in these. Just pointing out these sort of run-down, ramshackle-looking tractors. The Soviets must have been like, geez, I thought we were tough. How on earth did they do that? But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks again to Massey Ferguson. Amazing to let me have a look at the site. They were so kind and patient when I was filming. Big thanks to Odoo, of course, who have allowed us to do all of these crazy journeys over the last year to see all of this stuff. Big thanks to my patrons as well, too. Thanks to my patrons, I've actually launched my second channel, which is a little bit more about life on Rassay, maybe more focus on my odd vehicles and like, and building a house. I actually mentioned that earlier on in the video, and yeah, I think that's it. Thank you very much for watching. I'm now going to go investigate the odd oil slick that's building up underneath this tractor. So thanks very much. Bye-bye.